right, well, hello there, and welcome to the story so far. I'm Makoto Priano. I'm with ARC, a little open community of tinfoilers and lore nerds, and we do story stuff. And what this means here is that we can talk endlessly about triangles and drifters and all the rest of it. Unfortunately, this slot isn't endless, so we're going to have to dive in. But of course, because inevitably there are wrinkles in any plan, you know that video that played at the end of the keynote with the message from the Triglavians that was really hard to understand? So conveniently, some people on the internet listened to it a bunch. And I think mostly Astrashi and various other people for this. The transcript reads basically, the direction of the flow approaches liminality. Cladistic proving of the ancient domains commences. You will join the flow or be extirpated. And we'll go into what various parts of that mean later, but more importantly, let's get this show on the road. So first off, naturally, triangles are the topic of the day. That much is pretty much obvious. And we're going to start with recent events, not like what's happening right now, but what brought us to this point. Then we're going to talk about who the hell these people are, because they are people actually, sort of. It gets weird. And then we're going to talk about what they're up to. And from what they're up to, we're going to pivot to what they're trying to, or who they're trying to do, whatever it is to, which is, say, the enemies of the collective, which sort of at this point now includes us, I guess. And then any remaining time will be Q&A. And if we don't have much time for that, just find me in the halls and barrage me with theories or tinfoil or questions, and that's great. So let's begin with recent events. The first thing to talk about is something that you actually would have seen or heard about from FanFest in 2018, which was the time-based experiment. Concord, what was on with these weird anomalies in the data coming from Project Discovery. The long and short is that they figured out, there's another layer of dead space way down there. That's abyssal dead space. Now that we all know. What was interesting about the experiment event is that it also had this weird terrorist attack by someone who may have been corrupted by something red and triangly, and also rogue drones. And the drifters showed up to watch, which then led into, we think, the drifters figuring out, oh, hey, there are people we don't like in abyssal dead space, which may have been the kickoff to the war between the drifters and the Triglavians. And that led in turn to our seeing the large drifter fleets that were damaged, which naturally you have to kill because they're drifters, because why not kill them? Because that's, anyway. And from that, we started getting the videos that first started showing abyssal dead space and the ships that were involved. And if you've seen any of the weird triangle text, that's basically where it comes from, was all that work last spring. Not this last spring, but the spring prior. And then from there, we actually start getting to the point where we are, or various organizations are going into the abyss. Let's say not the drifters, but like humans, like us, or more like us at least. And this is where we get the weird event of Concord capturing a Triglavian cruiser in known space well before we had ever seen Triglavians in known space. And there's some weirdness with this, and there's weirdness with all of this. The first thing is that the crew of that cruiser was wearing a uniform with a logo that did not match any of the Triglavian clade logos. They weren't Perun, they weren't Velos, they weren't Svarog, they were something else. They were Triglavian, but who, we still don't know. And we don't even know if it had ended up in K-space by design, or if it was fleeing the drifters. But naturally, things went sideways. And by that I mean, say, Concord had promised to distribute the technology, and then Concord didn't, as it does, or not, as the case is. And the technology ended up being dispersed through rogue drone hives and then through the various pirate factions. So essentially, you can thank Concord not for giving us the technology. Rather, we stole it from people who stole it from people who may have gotten it directly from the Triglavians. Long story short. But that brings us much closer to modern day, which is to say that at, as was mentioned in the keynote, at certain points we started to find shipyards in the distance in the chaotic depths of the abyss. And that was where we started to see the Hodage world arc and find the semiosis consoles that allowed us to intercept, we thought, Triglavian messages. But what's interesting is on those semiosis consoles, thing one, Semiosis is a philosophical concept about the signification of meaning and the symbolizing of meanings. So it's essentially like maybe how the Triglavians like relay knowledge to each other, not just information, but knowledge. But also the Triglavians, we now today effectively know that we have these and know that we're listening in, because that message that was played in the keynote was actually first distributed through semiosis consoles about like 2 hours before that. So they know we're listening and they seem to be fine with it. The relevant is that toward the end we started seeing them surveying K-space. So it's like, we knew something was up. Here are these massive constructions. Here are the Triglavians talking about various unfriendly things. And then they start surveying systems like Niarja and such. And it's like, okay, right, we're going to meet these people soon. That's cool. But who are we meeting and shooting? Because it's Eve. The first thing to note is that these are people. These are humans. Or rather, I should say, these are post-humans. The technological developments that the collective has made is such that they have passed a point where consciousness is no longer firmly connected to body. So we are creatures of meat. Our brains are meat. In the case of the Triglavians, that doesn't really rule anymore. And so we end up seeing a few classes of Triglavian people. We see the Narodnya, which basically is Russian for folk or people. We see the Navka, who are, the word basically translates to souls, but it has implications about noble souls or souls wrongfully killed or that type of thing. And then we see Koshoy, and that's specifically referencing a Russian mythological character who's an immortal who puts his soul in an egg. Totally doesn't sound like Capsuleers, not at all. And by that I mean, say, it's probably sort of like Capsuleers, but we don't know if it necessarily maps one-to-one. But while we know that they are or were people, and which is to say they're not aliens, they aren't necessarily from modern New Eden. In the first place, the intercepts that we found at various points, and that's what this bit of triangle is right here, is one of the Triglavian intercepts, mentions the Chamber of Tyrants, the governing body of the Second Empire Jove. The Second Empire Jove haven't been around for hundreds of years. I mean, they're gone. And for that matter, the Third Empire Jove are basically also gone, which means that the Triglavians may have a better knowledge of the history of New Eden than any faction currently active, so far as we know. But at the same time, we also see mentions of the exact phrase is Jovian Triglavian satellite polity. And this implies that at the very least, the Triglavians don't consider themselves to be Jovian, though they may be. It might be that they've differentiated themselves. Or it may be that they are, in fact, simply not Jovian at all. Though this gets into a lot of questions about their use of trinary, blah, 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 blah. That rabbit hole is deep and we won't go down it at the moment. But the one question that we end up having with this mention of Jovian Triglavian satellite polity is like, where is this? What is this? Is this the region of Dieterid, where there are storms around planets and ancient runes, so clearly the Jovians blew up someone or someone blew themselves up? Or is this wormhole space? Are the Jovians, they're talking about the Sleepers, and they were the faction that was there in wormhole space with the Sleepers? We don't know yet. Hopefully we'll find out sooner or later. But these are just another of those weird little wrinkles and mysteries that we see with the Triglavians that we really want to find out more about. But this does bring me to the final point about the ancient history. So, okay, the Hordage, really cool, giant, has a conduit gate on the front of it. When we started seeing clips about its systems going online and consent verification and such and activation, all that, it mentioned that it was essentially a reactivation of a prior class of ship. And the name of this class is Kitiezh, which references a mythological Russian village, as is a common theme with the Triglavians. And this is sort of a Russian Atlantis story. This village was being attacked by the Mongols, very Russian, and instead of resisting, they prayed to be saved. And the village was swallowed by the waters. And the Mongols were naturally washed away. From this, you sort of get this idea that the Triglavians needed salvation from an attacker and fled into the abyss. Hundreds or thousands of years ago, we don't know the exact timeline. But They then lived in the abyss in that pressure cooker environment, and this is why they get so weird. Because when you're isolated in an extremely harsh environment, things just develop in ways that might not make sense to us. But getting carried away there. The relevant thing here is that the collective is not necessarily like the Borg. That's to say that they are not a top-down hierarchical structure where all impetus comes from the top. Rather, they seem to be decentralized and to focus on consent and assent. Basically, they seem to operate as triple sets, the smallest number that can form a supermajority, and they vote. So a set of 3 votes yes, yes, no. Okay, that set votes yes. Then 3 sets of 3 vote, and on it goes up in very triangle-y fashion. But at the same time, you see sever, dissent, and these terms that imply that they have this very strong moral indication that even if you're subjugating yourself, you have to subjugate yourself willingly. And we'll get more into that. But also relevant is that they do empower executives. The Zorya Triglav, which are focused on destroying the profane. The Kresnik Sverog, who are even more focused on destroying the profane, which is a theme you'll notice, specifically burning out Sancha and corruptive threats. And then you also see mention specifically of the detached executive troika for sublimation of Poshlost flow, which we think is shortened as subposorg. And we're pretty sure that might be another name, or at least I'm pretty sure it might be another name for Zorya Triglav, and it might be the organization running the incursions. There's a whole lot of we're guessing and not knowing that you may have noticed. But moving on. So what are they doing? The first thing they're doing, which you might not expect, is they're sort of seeking cooperation. And by cooperation, I mean, say, willing subjugation to their ideals. So maybe it's not cooperation at all. The video from earlier sort of changed the tenor of things, I'll say it that way. But the relevant thing is that they've sent detached Navka, basically bodiless souls or mind states or infomorphs, to the rogue drones to see what they're about. There are also indications that they will engage in mimetic exchange with people, and the subordinate isn't necessarily like, oh, hey, the Borg inject you with nanites and now you're suddenly a Borg yourself. It's more like they trade ideas with you in such a way that, oh, yeah, you really think their ideas are best and you're going to go along now, I guess. But the relevant part of all of this is that they don't seem to care whether or not the is made of meat. The fact that they seem to be perfectly fine with rogue drones cooperating with them and supporting Triglavian objectives is a pretty fair indication that they are just fine with any sentience, provided that that sentience is capable of moral and ideological action. But of course, we then get into the question of okay, well, how does this relate to us? And well, cladistic proving has been invoked. And what does this mean? Well, basically, it's trial by combat. Survival of the fittest, whatever term you want to use. And the relevant thing here is that from the video, we now know actually what this more or less means. So they've talked about glorification and mortification. Okay, glory and death, that's great. What do these things mean? Glory, well, in their case, it seems to be that glory means joining them, and dying, well, that means dying. So when we see, for instance, on this bit of triangles, liminal proving, they're testing the liminal space, that's say K space, the boundary between wormhole space and the abyssal dead space, and to see whether or not we're worthy of joining them. How this will play out and whether that's a completely wrong guess, which it might be, we'll see in due course. Of course, the next thing that they're doing is burning things with fire, because that is an ongoing theme. Basically, Poshlost, undoubted. Poshlost, it's basically profane or obscene things. If they think it's ideological counter to the ideals that they hold, like authoritarian power structures or that type of thing, then they're going to burn it to the ground. They're pretty cool with that. In fact, it seems to be an ongoing theme with them. Likewise, corruptive threats, like the Sancha. The Sancha they don't like because in the first place, the authoritarian structures, but in the second place, the Sancha and various ideas associated with them run counter to their own ideology. And lastly, they're pretty cool with killing vermin. And by vermin, you mean anything incapable of ideological or moral action. So rogue drones below a certain sentience level are vermin. Why? Because all they do is consume resources and reproduce, and they're basically sort of like gray goo except with claws. So they're not really goo. I digress. But let's talk about who they're doing these things to. And the first is obviously the drifters, which they call the ancient enemy Azdaja. Now, the first thing you'll notice, like, ancient enemy, huh, that's really suggestive. That's not subtle at all. No, it's not. And the implication that they have is that the drifters are, in fact, Second Empire Jove. They associate them with the Chamber of Tyrants. But they also go, something's wrong here. These tyrants aren't behaving the way we would expect them to. They don't know what's wrong. They're still going to burn it with fire because that's what they do. But there's something deeply wrong with their enemy, and they recognize this. And this is referred to, I believe, as a forbidden dominance arrangement, which we could go into that deep rabbit hole about, like, the others and like the Jove disease and so on. But, you know, that's, as I said, a deep rabbit hole. We've mentioned the Sansha. They refer to these as hive-linked foreign narodnia. Hive-linked, pretty obvious. A centralized domineering command structure, foreign, likewise obvious, narodnia, people. Pretty straightforward. The specific phrase used at one point is corruption of hive-linking, which is interesting, I should note, because in the first place, it looks like the Triglavians also use mind-to-mind interfaces as well. But hive-linking in this case must mean like that subjugating, subordinating element. Basically, you're no longer a willing participant. The moment you're in, you're done. And also worth noting is that the Sansha have been in the abyss, we've read, just not where we are, which fits into an ongoing theme of the Sansha ending up in strange places, like wormhole space, or in Jove space, or places that we can't. So in a very real way, the Sansha have become sort of like the modern faction that's rising most to the level of being able to threaten the precursors. And that lovely bit of art is actually, it's a Sansha invasion, and it looks like Sansha in a sleeper enclave, because that's not a totally creepy thing. Okay, so also I should talk about us. They don't seem to like us. And by that I mean, say, like they intend to have us either join them or die. And honestly, that about sums it up. I mean, there are mentions of highly perverse ideological mappings. Like, okay, we have some ideas they really don't like. And what it goes to from there, we don't really know. That's to say whether it's going to be that we can, in fact, join the collective and serve them, or whether ultimately we will be deemed in their eyes unworthy because of our ideas or our resistance to the collective. Which sort of runs counter to their trial by combat thing, but I'm not Triglavian, I can't really say what they want. But before we get to Q&A, I just want to make a few comments and a few shout-outs. In the first place, thanks to the people who have been keeping the fleets running, who have been joining on fleets, who've been tinfoiling us, who've been helping with translation or transliteration, or just throwing stuff at the wall to see what sticks. If you're interested in triangles and lore, come hang out with us. We like friends. It's a pretty open community. The Twitter account at Arataka Research has a link then to our Discord. You can join us in game consortium operations. And if you see this logo anywhere, feel free to harass the people about the lore. They're probably into it. And with that,